room went quiet the moment Aldous Pemberton walked through the door. Not the polite quiet that falls over a crowd when someone important enters. The other kind. The kind where people stop mid-sentence and turn, and you can feel their eyes move across you like they're trying to figure out what category to put you in, and they don't have a good one. Aldous was 26 years old. He was wearing a jacket he bought second-hand at a Salvation Army on Route 9, dark green with a small tear at the left cuff he tried to press flat that morning. His shoes were clean. That was the thing he always made sure of. His shoes were clean. That was the thing he always made sure of. His shoes were clean. His grandmother had told him once that you could measure a man by his shoes, and he hadn't forgotten it. He stood in the doorway of the Carver County Regional Culinary Invitational and looked at the other 31 competitors who had already checked in, set up their stations, arranged their tools with the practiced ease of people who'd been doing this for years. Some of them had chef's whites so starched they practically crackled when they moved. Some of them wore jackets with their names embroidered on the breast pocket. Some of them had sous chefs carrying their equipment in branded cases. Aldous had a canvas tote from a grocery store going out of business 3 years prior. He found a station, number 17, near the back corner, close to the industrial dishwasher that ran every 20 minutes and rattled the whole wall, and he set his bag down and he started to unpack. The man at Station 16 watched him do it. His name was Fletcher Kwan, and he was 43 years old and had been the executive chef at Mirabelle, a restaurant in downtown Charleston that had held its Michelin star for 6 consecutive years. He had competed in this invitational 4 times. He had won it twice. His knife roll was hand-stitched Italian leather, and the knives inside it had been made by a craftsman in Osaka who had a 3-year waiting list. Fletcher watched Aldous arrange a set of knives that had clearly come from a restaurant supply store. He watched him pull a well-worn copy of a culinary notebook from his bag, its cover held together with a rubber band. He watched him take a breath and look around the room as if he was memorizing it. Then Fletcher turned to the man at Station 15 and said, loud enough to carry, "Did someone lose a busboy?" The man at Station 15, a compact, precise woman named Ingrid Sato, who ran a catering company out of Atlanta, did not laugh. She pressed her lips together and looked at her mise-en-place. Someone else did, though. 2 stations down, a kid from a culinary school in New York named Bo Ashton laughed and then caught himself and looked at his hands. Aldous heard it. You always heard it. You develop a very precise ear for that particular frequency of laughter when you've been on the receiving end of it your whole life. He didn't look up. He just kept setting up his station. The Invitational had a $200,000 prize, the largest culinary competition prize in the southeastern United States. First place received $140,000 and a sponsored placement at a flagship restaurant of the winner's choosing for a full calendar year. Food press from 6 publications would be in the audience. The winner would be featured in a spread in Southern Table magazine. It was the kind of event that could change a person's entire trajectory. Most of the people in that room knew each other. They crossed paths at other competitions, at industry events, at the kinds of dinners regular people don't get invited to. They had shorthand with each other, shared references, shared contacts. They moved through the room like it belonged to them. Aldous had driven 4 hours from Prentiss, Mississippi, where he worked the breakfast and lunch shift at a diner called Doris's on the edge of town. He had submitted his application to the Invitational 7 months ago, not expecting anything. The application had asked for a statement of culinary philosophy, a sample menu proposal, and 2 letters of recommendation. He had written the philosophy statement at the counter of Doris's between the morning rush and the lunch rush, longhand, on 3 sheets of paper towel, because he'd run out of notebook pages. He'd photographed it and typed it up later on the library computer. His letters of recommendation had come from Doris Callahan herself, who ran the diner and had employed him for 5 years, and from a retired professor of food science named Dr. Walter Hines, who came in every Saturday morning for the same order. 2 eggs over easy, wheat toast, black coffee, and who had, over the course of 2 years of Saturday mornings, had the most substantive conversations about food that Aldous had ever had with another human being. He had not expected them to accept him. When the acceptance letter came, he'd read it 3 times standing in the parking lot of the diner, then he'd gone inside and finished his shift. The competition structure was 2 rounds. The first round asked competitors to prepare 3 dishes using a specified core ingredient that would be revealed the morning of competition. The second round for the top 8 finishers would be a freestyle showcase. Their best work, their choice, 45 minutes. Judging was scored on technique, creativity, flavor, and presentation. The core ingredient was announced at 8 o'clock. Catfish. There was a low murmur through the room. A few people smiled. A few people made quick notes. Aldous didn't move for a moment. He just stood there with his eyes closed, and if you'd been watching him, really watching him, you might have noticed that he didn't look worried. He looked like he was listening to something only he could hear. Then he opened his eyes, looked at the ingredient table, and began. He had been cooking catfish since he was 11 years old. His mother, Lavona, had grown up on the banks of the Pearl River, and her mother before her had cooked catfish in a cast-iron skillet over a wood stove. And the recipe had traveled forward in time through the hands of women who learned by feel and by smell and by the sound of the oil hitting the pan. Lavona had taught Aldous in that same way. Not from a book, not from a culinary school module on regional American protein preparation, from standing beside her in the kitchen and watching and then doing and then getting corrected and then doing again until it was right. He had spent 15 years doing other things with that foundation, reading obsessively, cookbooks, food science texts, agricultural history, the chemical processes that happen between heat and fat and protein. Working every station he could get himself hired into, from the fryer at a chain restaurant when he was 17 to prep cook at a mid-range steakhouse to line cook to the diner, where he'd eventually been given full creative control over the menu because Doris had gotten tired of fighting him on it, and the customers had started asking specifically for his dishes. He had taken that catfish knowledge and layered 12 years of self-education on top of it, and what it produced was something that existed nowhere else. What he made in that first round was this: a shallow poached catfish and a court bouillon he built from scratch using smoked corn cobs, dried chilies, and the woody ends of fresh herbs. A broth that took 40 minutes to develop and that he started the moment the clock began, because he knew he'd need it. The catfish was finished with a cane syrup glaze, applied in the last 2 minutes of cooking, and plated over a cold succotash dressed with a citrus vinaigrette that cut through the sweetness with surgical precision. The garnish was a single compressed watermelon cube. Tiny, perfect, carrying the whisper of jalapeno oil. His second dish was a catfish mousse. He had no food processor, so he worked by hand, grinding the fish, incorporating the fat incrementally, building the texture with nothing but technique and patience. He formed it into a cylinder, wrapped it in blanched collard green leaves, tied it and steamed it. He plated it with a red pepper coulis he'd made in 12 minutes flat, and a dusting of toasted spice mix he brought from home in a small glass jar. His third dish broke with tradition entirely. He filleted the catfish thin, almost translucent, and cured it for 14 minutes in a salt-sugar-citrus mixture while he assembled a cold preparation underneath it, thinly sliced cucumber, a smear of something white and creamy that turned out to be a whipped ricotta seasoned with fresh dill and a touch of horseradish and a scatter of pickled mustard seeds he had also brought from home. He laid the cured catfish over it like a veil, finished with a thread of good olive oil and a few flakes of smoked salt. It did not look like anything else in that room. The judges moved through the stations in order. There were 3 of them: a food journalist named Celeste Moreau, a chef named Erin Trigg, who ran a celebrated restaurant in New Orleans, and a woman named Frances Okwu, who had been a fixture in the southeastern food world for 30 years and who had, over that time, developed a reputation for being impossible to impress. At Fletcher Quan's station, Frances Okwu tasted his first dish, a pan-seared catfish with a classical French beurre blanc, and nodded with the expression of someone who has just confirmed what they already knew to be true. At Station 17, Frances Okwu tasted the first dish, the shallow poached catfish and smoked corn bouillon, and she stopped. She set down her fork. She picked it back up and tasted again. Then she looked at the dish as if she was trying to understand the geometry of it. Celeste Moreau, who had been making notes, looked up and watched her. "What's in the broth?" Frances asked. Aldous told her. She looked at him, really looked at him, maybe for the first time since she'd entered that room. He was standing very still, his jacket with the torn cuff, his grocery store tote bag folded under the station. His hands, which were the hands of someone who had been working with them their whole life, steady and unhurried at his sides. "You built this in 40 minutes," she said. 38, he said. "I started it first." She nodded slowly, the way people do when something is rearranging itself in their minds. By the time she reached his third dish, the cured catfish over whipped ricotta, Aaron Trigg had already eaten it twice. He had gone back for a second taste, which was unusual. He was standing beside Frances now, and he said very quietly, so that only she and Celeste could hear, "He's got something." The first round scores were posted at noon. Aldous was first. The room shifted when it happened. You could feel it move through people like a temperature change. Some of them looked at the scoreboard and then at each other. Some of them looked at their own scores and then at Aldous's name and did the arithmetic in their heads, trying to find the calculation error. Fletcher Quan looked at the scoreboard for a long time without saying anything. Then he walked past Aldous's station on his way to the water station, and he said, not loudly, not to anyone in particular, "Beginner's luck runs out in the second round." Aldous didn't respond. He was cleaning his station, careful and methodical, setting it back to 0 for whatever came next. The woman at Station 16, Ingrid Sato, walked past him going the other direction and said, at the same volume, "Strong first round." He looked up. She nodded at him, once, with the straight-ahead acknowledgement of one professional recognizing another. He nodded back. In the break between rounds, 8 competitors advanced. Aldous was among them. So was Fletcher. So was Ingrid Sato. So was Beau Ashton from the culinary school in New York, who had spent the last 2 hours looking at Aldous's station from across the room with an expression he was still trying to name. The second round began at 2 o'clock, 45 minutes, open preparation, best work. Fletcher had prepared for this round, specifically. He had known what he would make before he entered the building that morning. It was a dish he had been developing for 3 months, something he intended to put on Maribel's fall menu, and he had decided to debut it here because this was the room where it would be seen by the people who mattered. The dish was technically extraordinary. A terrine of heritage pork with a truffle gelée, plated with microgreens from his restaurant's rooftop garden, dried in his dehydrator, finished with an aged vinegar that had been in his family for years. It was the kind of dish that announced itself, that said, "Look at what I have access to, look at what I have built, and over how long, and with what resources." Aldous had 45 minutes and a canvas tote, and the things he brought from home in small glass jars. He made bread. Rather, he made something that began as bread. He had a small container of active starter in his bag. He had been feeding it for 2 weeks in preparation, carrying it on the drive up from Mississippi in a cooler, maintaining its temperature, checking it at every gas station stop. He incorporated it into a dough he mixed by hand, portioned it into small rounds, and baked them in the competition oven. And the smell that came off them when they opened was the smell of something ancient and alive. But that was not the dish. While the bread baked, he made a braise. He had pre-treated a short rib the night before in his motel room, had brought his own portable burner, his own Dutch oven, had been up until 1 in the morning starting a braise he then partially cooled, carried to the competition in insulated containers, and finished now in the final 20 minutes with precision he had calculated down to the minute. The braising liquid had reduced to something nearly black, intensely concentrated, and he mounted it with a cold knob of butter at the end until it had the sheen of lacquer. The garnish was something he'd made at home weeks before and jarred, a persimmon preserve with star anise and a tiny amount of apple cider vinegar, the sweetness held in perfect tension with the acid. He plated it this way, the small round of bread, torn at the table, its interior still steaming, crumb open and irregular and beautiful in the way only fermented bread can be. The short rib over it, lacquered in that dark reduction. The persimmon preserve in a small spoonful beside it, a single celery leaf raw, for the green and the slight bitterness. That was it. No microgreens, no truffle, no 6-year-old vinegar, no rooftop garden. He stood back and looked at it, and then he looked at the clock, and he had 4 minutes remaining, and he used them to clean his station. Frances Okwu came to his station last. She sat down across from him. The judges were seated for the second round, and competitors served them, and for 45 seconds Aldous stood across a table from Frances Okwu and waited while she looked at his plate. She tore a piece of the bread. She said nothing for a long time. Then she said, Where are you from? Prentice, Mississippi, he said. Where do you work? A diner, he said, called Doris's. She looked at the bread in her hand. Who taught you to make bread like this? I taught myself, he said. Took about 2 years to get the starter right. She put the bread in her mouth. Something crossed her face that Francis Okwu's face did not often allow, something unguarded, something that said, "This is better than I expected, and I did not expect to be surprised today." She tasted the rib. She tasted the preserve. She set down her fork and she looked at him with the direct, evaluating gaze of someone who has spent 30 years figuring out what is real and what is performance. You drove up from Mississippi, she said. Yes, ma'am. In what? My Civic, he said. Got about 200,000 miles on it. She almost smiled. Did you have trouble with the braze, carrying it? I lost some temperature in the second stop, he said. I had to adjust. I'd planned for it. She nodded. What's your name? Aldous, he said. Aldous Vane. She repeated it, not to him, not to anyone, just to herself, the way you do when you want to remember something. The scores were posted at 4:15. First place, Aldous Vane. The prize was $140,000, and the sponsored placement, and the feature in Southern Table, and the kind of silence that falls over a room when something has happened that none of the narratives anyone brought in that morning were able to accommodate. Fletcher Quan stood at the back of the room and did not move for a while. Then he walked over to the administrator's table and asked about the verification process for the scores. He was told, politely, that the scoring had been reviewed and was final. He walked back. He looked at Aldous for a long time, and Aldous looked back, not with triumph, not with anything that resembled the satisfaction of having proved a point, but with the patient, clear-eyed steadiness of someone who has spent a long time knowing exactly what he was worth and waiting for the world to catch up. Fletcher opened his mouth, closed it again. Then he said, quietly and without any of the easy performance of the morning, "That bread." Aldous waited. "I want to know about the starter," Fletcher said. And that was how they talked for the next 40 minutes, standing at the edge of a competition floor that still smelled of everything they'd cooked, the scoring board still up behind them, the name Aldous Vane at the top of it in a font that had been designed to hold names like Fletcher Quan's. It held his just fine. Francis Okwu stopped him on the way out of the building. The photographer from Southern Table was packing up behind her, and the other competitors were moving through the lobby in clusters, the low-voiced kind of conversation that follows an unexpected result. She said, "Do you know what you have?" He said, "I think so." She said, "I want to be clear with you. I've been doing this for 30 years. What you made today. The technique is real, but technique can be learned. What can't be learned is what you did with the broth in the first round. The decision to start it first, the understanding that time was the ingredient. That's not something you learn in a school. That's something you understand because you've been cooking with constraints your whole life and you learn to think differently because of it." He looked at her. "A lot of talented people come through these rooms," she said, "and they are talented, and that's real. But you cook like every ingredient counts, like there is no backup plan. That is a rare thing. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." He thanked her. She nodded and walked toward the doors, and at the threshold she turned once, briefly, as if she'd thought of something else, but then she just raised a hand and went through. Aldous stood in the lobby of the Carver County Convention Center with a check that would change the course of his life, and his canvas grocery tote over his shoulder, and his shoes clean, and he thought about his grandmother telling him you could measure a man by his shoes. And he thought about his mother showing him how to listen to the oil in the pan, and he thought about 2 years of feeding a starter in the small apartment above the laundromat in Prentice, tending it like it was something alive that needed him, which it was. And he thought about all of the mornings he had driven to Doris's before the sun came up, and stood in a kitchen that was too small and too hot and made the same things better each time. Not because anyone was watching, but because that was the only way he knew how to work. Doris Callahan texted him 20 minutes later because he had sent her a photo of the scoreboard. The text said, "I could have told them." He typed back, "I know you could have." She sent back a string of emojis he didn't fully parse, and then, "Don't forget us when you're famous." He put his phone in his pocket and walked out to the parking lot, found his Civic, gray, high mileage, reliable, and put the tote in the back seat and sat in the driver's seat for a while without starting the engine. It was late afternoon, and the light was doing something particular to the parking lot, long and amber and very still. He thought about the 4-hour drive home. He thought about the fall menu he'd been drafting in the margins of his notebook for 3 months, the one he'd never had a real platform to make. He thought about the conversation he needed to have with Dr. Hines next Saturday over 2 eggs over easy and black coffee. Then he started the car. Some people spend their whole lives waiting for the world to see what they already know about themselves. Aldous Vane had spent his 26 years doing something different. He had simply kept cooking in the too small kitchen with the too few resources for the customers who came in before sunrise and needed something real, and he had trusted that the work would speak when it was given a room large enough to hear it. That day in Carver County, the room was finally large enough, and it heard every word. I keep thinking about what Aldous did in that first round. Not the dish itself, though the dish was extraordinary, but the decision he made before anyone else in that room had picked up a knife. He started the broth first, 45 minutes of competition time, and he used the opening seconds to begin something that most people wouldn't even think to build from scratch in that context. Not because he was showing off, because he understood, in a way that only comes from years of working with very little, that time was the most valuable ingredient in the room. That's not technique, that's character. That's what happens when a person has spent so long doing the right thing in rooms where nobody's watching, that it becomes the only way they know how to operate. I think about the people in that room who laughed, not because I want to assign blame. Most of them were operating on a very human kind of shorthand, the kind we all use when we're trying to sort the world quickly. A man with a second-hand jacket and a grocery store tote bag walks into a room full of people with Italian leather knife rolls, and the brain makes a calculation. The problem isn't the calculation. The problem isn't the calculation. The problem is mistaking the calculation for the truth. What Fletcher Kwan didn't know, couldn't have known from the outside, was the interior of that canvas tote. The 2 years of feeding a starter in a small apartment above a laundromat. The persimmon preserve made weeks in advance. The braise started the night before in a motel room at 1 in the morning. The entire architecture of preparation that no one could see because it had happened in private, in Prentice, Mississippi, over years of mornings before the sun came up. Aldous didn't walk into that competition with resources. He walked in with integrity, with the habit of doing the work completely, even when the reward was uncertain, even when no one was there to evaluate it. That kind of integrity doesn't develop overnight. It develops through accumulated choices, small ones, made in the direction of doing something well, rather than doing something that looks well. There's a difference, and most people never locate it. And then there's what Frances Akwu said to him on the way out. She said he cooked like every ingredient counted, like there was no backup plan. I've been turning that over ever since I heard it, because I think it describes something that goes beyond cooking. The people who change things, in any field, in any room, are often the ones who learn to think differently because they had to. Constraint, over a long enough period, does something to the mind. It teaches resourcefulness in a way that abundance simply cannot replicate. Aldous Vane had the intelligence to study deeply across 15 years without a school telling him what to study or when. He had the character to keep working honestly in a too small kitchen for customers who would never know his name. And he had the persistence to drive 4 hours in a 200,000-mile Civic with a braise in a cooler and a starter in a temperature-controlled bag because he believed the work was worth the effort of being seen. Those 3 things together, the mind that keeps learning, the character that stays honest, the will that doesn't stop, that's what was standing at Station 17. The scoreboard just finally said so out loud.